The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
With President Joe Biden making trips abroad to meet with the G7, NATO, and of course Russian President Vladimir Putin, was this a case of Biden's excellent adventure or a bogus journey for the DC veteran? As with all foreign diplomacy escapades, it is in fact a test, especially so for Joe Biden, whose critics say he can't cut the mustard on the world stage. And it was a test. But perhaps we should be asking that most important question. Who's grading it? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and today we have a packed lineup for you. We'll be chatting to conservative author and speaker Cal Thomas on Israel's change of leadership and how the US intends to deal with its most important Middle Eastern ally. We'll be looking at the fun and foibles of Joe Biden's first foreign quest as President of the United States. And joining us later is Dave Patterson, retired U.S. Air Force pilot and the former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller, to get a fresh perspective on the Biden-Putin summit. But first, let's hear what the big players have to say on Liberty Nation's signature Say What segment. Senior White House correspondent for CNN, Jeff Delaney, highlighted an issue that is becoming more and more apparent as this presidency continues. President Biden seems to be protected from answering questions, especially those that are not pre-approved by the White House staff. Speaking on the scene in Geneva, he said this.
What we've not seen him do is answer questions like that without his aides screaming at him to stop. I have never seen a president, covering the last four of them, who is so protected by his aides in terms of often not wanting him to answer some questions.
And whether that's because he and his staff prefer him not to go off script, who knows? But one thing is clear. When he does, it's often disastrous. When preparing to leave the summit, the president got called on by a reporter asking why he was so confident that President Putin would have taken the meeting on board and changed his behavior. The ensuing explosion was just a brief flash of the temper that we've seen on the campaign trail from Joe Biden before. Here's what happened.
Why are you so confident he'll change his behavior, Mr. President?
Yeah, I'm not confident he'll change his behavior. What the hell? What do you do all the time? So when did I say I was confident?
You said in the next 6 months you'll be able to determine.
What I said was, let's get it straight. I said what will change their behavior is that the rest of the world reacts to them and it diminishes their standing in the world. I'm not confident of anything. I'm just stating the fact.
But given his past behavior has not changed, and in that press conference after sitting down with you for several hours, he denied any involvement in cyber attacks. He downplayed human rights abuses. He even refused to say Alexei Navalny's name. So how does that account to a constructive meeting as President Putin?
You don't understand that. You're in the wrong business.
Is the summit with China next? Who we need to love? Who we need to love? Quickly, let's go. Quickly, cool.
So did the president actually get something of value from his meetings with Vladimir Putin? Well, that's the $64,000 question. The key issues under discussion were Nord Stream sanctions, the START program, and cybersecurity. In recent weeks, the issue of cyber attacks really has been the key point that has hit the American public literally where the rubber meets the road. Gas prices have risen, and we saw footage of long queues and empty pumps. And then, of course, the beef scare. This could have been a big win for the president if he came away with assurances that Russia would do all in its power to prevent these attacks. Speaking at his after-summit presser, Joe Biden suggested that he had done just that.
Cybersecurity. I talked about the proposition that certain critical infrastructure should be off limits to attack, period, by cyber or any other means. I gave them a list. If I'm not mistaken, I don't have it in front of me, 16 specific entities.
Well, maybe it will work. Based on what he says here, it's not certain whether President Putin actually agreed to these off-limit infrastructure demands, or indeed if he has any power to stop them happening. Remember, the Colonial Pipeline attack was actually carried out by someone in Northern California, with DarkSide, the hacking group that's made all the front pages of the newspapers, just being the middleman that supplies the malware. So 16 critical infrastructures may be protected, maybe not. The National Review senior writer, David Hassani, he gave a rather sober assessment of the president's plan. He said, biggest loser today, the 17th most critical infrastructure entity in America. One group that did seem pleased was the ever-reliable Fourth Estate. From the very first moment, the American public saw what kind of coverage they could expect. CNN's Jim Scutio watched the moment the two leaders first met in Geneva, and he had this to say.
You know, these moments are about moments. And I'll tell you one moment I noticed there in the Biden-Putin interaction. The handshake, Biden looked Putin in the eye with a smile. Putin looked away. Again, you don't want to read too much or too little, but again, these are about public posturing. It's about how you project strength. And that was a notable moment to me.
Naturally, CNN was roundly mocked for those rose-tinted glasses. But in the president's defense, he sure did seem to be having the time of his life. And a large number of Democrats are hailing this as an historic and significant win. Someone who disagrees with that assessment is former Ambassador Nikki Haley. Here she is speaking with Fox News.
Here now to react is former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Ambassador Nikki Haley, just back from Israel. Ambassador, what can you expect to see when Joe Biden's looking in 2 or 3 months to see if Russia changes behavior? What do you expect?
Brian, we don't need to wait 2 or 3 months. We're not going to see anything. I mean, here you've got the fact that he didn't call them out on the hacking. You know, Putin wants to say Russian hackers did it and he wasn't involved. Well, guess what? The hackers work for Putin. Putin was very much responsible for that. He just didn't want his fingerprints on it. So they didn't go and say they were going to hold him accountable for the hacking of the pipeline and the food processing company. He didn't go and talk to him about election meddling, which they've done the last 2 elections. He didn't talk about Ukraine, which Biden just gave Putin a great big kiss by giving him Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It's all he's ever wanted. It's going to get him a ton of money. It's going to make him energy independent. And it's pretty much set Putin off for the one thing he really wanted. You know, they're not talking about the fact that they're going to have the back of Ukraine and say exactly how they're going to do it. I mean, this was something where they talked about climate change. You know, and then you didn't even talk about the fact that they talked about the fact that the New START agreement and that they're going to agree on that. Well, the New START agreement allows them to stall their production. But guess who wins with that? China, because China's not involved in the agreement. So nothing's going to come of this.
Ambassador Haley not pulling any punches. And then we have former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, who perhaps highlighted the main problem that Joe Biden has right now.
It's pretty pathetic when Joe Biden is more strenuous in his arguments with a reporter than he is with Vladimir Putin. You know, we believe that Vladimir Putin is going to change. Here's what's going to happen. He's going to get more and more bold. He saw the weakness of Joe Biden, the president of the United States. He never saw that when Donald Trump was in the White House. Listen, here's the problem. He didn't get the easy questions from the 7 hand-selected reporters that he had to call on. He didn't get to answer what color or what flavor of ice cream he liked. You know, when you're looking at Joe Biden, you have to think, well, the curtains are blowing, but the window must be closed.
If the president is not given free rein to speak to the press openly and honestly, the American people end up with little more than canned sound bites and a frustrated commander-in-chief who can't get back into the swing of a high-level position. The mainstream media may think they're protecting Joe Biden, but in reality, they may just be his undoing. We'll be right back after this short break.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
What of the big meeting with President Vladimir Putin? Who ate whose lunch? Who appeared the real statesman? And was anything of substance really achieved at this widely anticipated semi-summit? To help us sift through the debris, we're joined by Liberty Nation author Dave Patterson, a former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller and retired Air Force pilot. Welcome, Dave.
Welcome. Thank you very much. That's a great introduction. I appreciate that. And glad to be with you, Mark.
Really my pleasure to have you here. So, Dave, we're seeing the spin from both sides of the political aisle here. Can you give us your estimation of who, if anyone, came out on top?
I think you have to look at the summit from two perspectives. One is, perhaps a little bit on the inside baseball strategic communications, and then on the substantive issues. From the aspect of strategic communications, Mark, I think that the White House agreeing to let Putin go first and by himself was a huge mistake. I think it was emblematic of why it was such a terrible decision. With the last question that the Canadian reporter asked President Putin, and she relayed a question from her 9-year-old daughter, and it gave Putin the opportunity to wax on about international relations and peace and freedom, and he left the stage a statesman. Contrast that with President Biden, who left the stage arguing with one of the pool reporters. The optics, not exactly good for President Biden. On the substantive issues, I think that Putin didn't even need to go to the summit. I mean, he got what he wanted. Sanctions lifted on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and a 5-year extension to the New START treaty talks, which is what he was really after with President Biden.
So do you think that much of the actual decisions here, as you mentioned, the 5-year extension and the sanctions lifted on Nord Stream, do you think this was all organized in advance by the apparatchiks? And really the actual summit itself was more just a photo opportunity for the two world leaders?
It may have been organized on the part of the Russians. I'm not so sure about the American side. But if it were organized by the State Department and our diplomats, they did a bad job. Because what they did is they left the president simply talking about the atmospherics of the summit, while President Putin got to answer substantive questions and put his position clearly out there for the press. And President Biden was just playing catch up.
That's actually a topic I want to delve into a little bit, Dave, if I may. So as you alluded to earlier, President Biden and Putin, they held separate press conferences, which is in itself, that's a bit of an oddity. And CNN actually suggested that this was in order to avoid conflicting messages. And that really struck out at me. Now, what was so divergent in their summations? Why would they opt for this rather unnatural format?
Well, I think first of all, to eliminate divergent points of view, no. That's exactly what you want to do. You don't want one of your opponents being able to say something that you drastically disagree with and not be there to rebut it. So that's kind of a silly argument to put forward. But the reason I think that it may have been purely logistics, they're heading off in different places. But my sense is that, and this is a somewhat cynical perspective, my sense is that the White House did not want the president in a circumstance where he is taking ad hoc questions and speaking off the cuff to be compared immediately to Putin, who has his script down perfectly. He's a KGB agent, after all. I mean, he's a former KGB officer. I mean, he is an expert at deflecting questions.
Yeah, I kind of got that impression myself, especially when I'm sure many people have noticed of late, President Biden, I'm sure he's semi-joking when he says, I'm not allowed to answer any more questions or I'll be in trouble. But all the questions that he has been having, they are approved questions, presumably by the White House press staff. So when he was confronted at the end by the reporter that you mentioned earlier, and he kind of flew off the handle at her, do you think that was an outswelling of frustration at not being able to do what he has actually been doing for the last 5 decades, is thinking on his feet and dealing with press and people, and he's always had quite a short temper in these situations. But do you think the frustration's been getting to him?
I think it's always a bad thing to start to ascribe motivation to what people say.
I believe Joe Biden said that exact line during one of the debates.
Yes, well, if he can steal trust but verify, I'll take one of his.
I did notice he didn't quite produce it with the elan of Ronald Reagan, but it was there. The words were there, but as Eric Morecambe and Ernie Wise used to say, I am saying the right words, just not necessarily in the right order. So, Dave, you wrote an article recently on LibertyNation.com that discussed the notable Russian summits of the past. And it's a wonderful piece, and it really provides a unique insight and perspective on these kind of events. How do you think this particular summit be remembered?
I think it will be remembered as long as the subjects are brought up and as long as both President Biden and President Putin discuss them and the issues in coming meetings. But historically, probably will go down with James Buchanan talking with his staff.
That's an interesting perspective to have on it. And Dave, last question, if I may. Now, they've discussed, obviously, cybersecurity and the Nord Stream, and they've discussed different areas of cooperation going forward. Do you think that this presages a closer relationship, a better relationship, or is it more, as you pointed out, an opportunity for Vladimir Putin to appear the statesman on the world stage?
I think that this is pretty much a vanilla summit. It's pretty hard to draw any conclusions about future relationships from it. Both went away saying that the talks were constructive, and I think that's on page 462 of the State Department Diplomatic Speak Handbook. And so I think that what you will see in the future is much more in terms of the working groups between the two countries' diplomatic staffs.
Okay, one follow-up on that. Do you think this semi-summit has helped or hindered President Biden's reputation domestically?
Oh, I mean, if you're going to be relying on the barometer of our media, he was fantastic and couldn't have done a better job. But, you know, they're going to realize at some point that this was not his finest hour and that go on to some other subject.
Dave Patterson, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. It's been a pleasure being with you.
And you're listening to Liberty Nation Radio. We'll be right back after this short break.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com. With one click, you get tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Hot Topics and Analysis, Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles. And now, you can keep your kids ahead of the curve with LNGenZ.com. LN Gen Z brings a free-thinking education right into your home for students of every grade level with articles, videos, worksheets, and ready-to-go curriculum. While the media establishment giants are sleeping, you can stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
And I'm joined by one of the biggest and brightest stars of the conservative movement, Mr. Cal Thomas, who's not only a prolific writer of thought-provoking articles, but also books, his latest being America's Expiration Date, The Fall of Empires and Superpowers, and the Future of the United States. Always a pleasure to chat with you. Thanks for being here, Cal.
Well, thank you, Mark. Always a pleasure to speak with someone who speaks the English language the way it was intended.
Oh, with a Birmingham accent. So, Cal.
The England, not Alabama, yes.
So I want to specifically talk today about the now former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He's recently been ousted from his position by Naftali Bennett. Now, Cal, you know Mr. Netanyahu personally, so could you tell us a little bit about how this came about?
He's former, but maybe not for long. He's threatened to come back, and that he's a lot like Donald Trump. I first met Bibi, as he's affectionately known, when he was at the Israeli embassy in Washington, and I was a reporter there and later a columnist. I was impressed by him immediately, not only because of his virtually accent-free English, but his personality, his knowledge of and understanding of America and the political positions of various presidents that have differed over the years, especially with respect to the Middle East. Then I've known him through several prime ministerships. I remember on a visit to Jerusalem in 2016, I get into his office and he says, sit down, I want to know all about Donald Trump. I said, wait a minute, I've come here to interview you. I want to know what's going on in Israel. No, tell me about it. So we had a conversation about Donald Trump, and then finally we had a conversation about what I had come for. He's incredibly likable. He's got a great sense of humor. And I think he's been very, very good for Israel at a time of great challenges, not only from the likes of Barack Obama and now Joe Biden, but remember Obama had sent a team over to Israel to undermine one of the Israeli elections. And that caused great anger among Netanyahu and his supporters. But I could go through a list of things that I think he's done for Israel, and the Jerusalem Post carried an opinion piece the other day, if you want to hear some of them.
Yeah, please do, yes.
Yeah. Well, he certainly should take credit for what's known as the Abraham Accords, which normalized relations with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, something that had not been done before.
Actually, can I interrupt you on that one, Cal, please?
Yeah.
Because I'd like to know the Abraham Accords. We really haven't heard much about them in recent months. Let's say, just for example, 6 months, almost to the day. We haven't heard much about this. Well, why is that? Why is the Biden administration not building upon what many people see as a very successful start to the unthinkable, previously unthinkable peace in the Middle East?
Yeah, well, they're not building on a lot of things, including the wall on our southern border with Mexico. But that aside for the moment, I think it's because they are still locked in this flawed equation that somehow a two-state solution for the Palestinians getting their own state is going to bring peace to the entire region. That has never been an issue. If it was, all of these other countries that had before denounced Israel and the Jewish people, the mullahs who had called for the eradication of the Jewish state and the killing of all Jews, that would not be an issue. You have to listen to what they say. In the Middle East, there are two tracks. There are what people tell their own people, and there are what they tell the West. And what they tell the West is Palestinian state is what we want, and then we'll live at peace with Israel. But what they tell their own people is this is just a stepping stone to a one-state solution, meaning one dominated by Muslims and Arabs and Palestinians. So that's what you have to see through. And I think Netanyahu, more than any other prime minister, except for maybe Menachem Begin and Golda Meir, understood that and could articulate it to the West. When he came to address the Congress a few years ago and held up that chart about Iran, he did the same thing at the UN, and how close it is to nuclear weapons and how bad that would be for further destabilizing and possibly starting a nuclear war in the region. It was a powerful moment. And of course, the media and a lot of the left are still into this bogus notion, just giving Israel's enemies what they want will make them lie down like lambs and lions. Not going to happen.
So, I mean, if I do have my numbers correct here, Bibi Netanyahu, he has around 30 seats in his party, while Bennett has, I think it's 7. So therefore, Bennett has to rely entirely on this myriad mix of coalition partners who are not natural bedfellows. And what we're seeing is in the Western media, they're cheering Netanyahu's removal as almost a win for democracy, when the reality, as far as I can see, math-wise, is that very few people would have backed Mr. Bennett to become prime minister, and it's more political horse trading that's put him in place. Why is that?
Right. Well, two things about that, Mark. Number one, the parallels with what is happening in the United States are just so obvious. It wasn't that so many people were in favor of Joe Biden, who is basically a colorless, personality-less individual, is that so many hated Donald Trump that anybody would have been preferable to them other than Trump. And the same thing happened with Netanyahu. That's why you got this coalition together. The final Knesset vote making Bennett prime minister was 60 to 59. That's almost as close as the Democrat majority in the House of Representatives. And that's why Netanyahu says that he believes he'll be able to undermine the government and make a comeback. So that, that's a continuing thing. The other thing is Israel has too many parties. I mean, the parliamentary system in the UK, of course, is much different with fewer parties. But they have, 8, 10 parties? And no Israeli election since the founding of the modern state of Israel has ever provided a majority vote. It's all been coalition parties. And that doesn't bring a stable government.
Yeah, so there is obviously there's been a lot of uncertainty in the region with election after election. How long does Prime Minister Bennett really believe he can hold this coalition together? I mean, as you say, it's 8 or 10 parties. It appears to be a completely ungovernable situation. So,
well, I think it depends on how much hatred for Netanyahu continues. If this coalition thinks that if they break up, then Netanyahu's going to get back into office, their whole premise of their coalition disappears in the first place. They had this coalition, including secular parties, including an Arab party for the first time, in order to get rid of Netanyahu. But if they see that the threat of his coming back is real in the next election, that could force them to have a continuing marriage of convenience, as it were.
Let's move on to President Joe Biden and his relationship with Israel here. Obviously, I heard that when the first time that Joe Biden spoke with Prime Minister Netanyahu, it was about a month into the term. But with Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, it was within 2 hours. Why the disparity here?
Well, I think that the Biden administration hopes that they can either manipulate or encourage those parties within the coalition to move ahead toward that totally unworkable goal of a two-state solution. Israel is regarded either directly or indirectly, either overtly or subtly, as the problem in the area. You look at the language of diplomats of the past. Israel is pressured to do this and that in order to pacify the Palestinians or its Arab neighbors or Muslim fanatics. And if Israel would only bow down, kneel down, lie down, and in some cases even die, then everything would be fine in the region. There's a certain amount of anti-Semitism to this. There's a certain amount of diplomatic idiocy in this. There's a certain amount of historical ignorance in this. And all of these combined, I think, continues to contribute to the notion of Israelites that in the end, they're on their own, as Menachem Begin told me, and nobody's going to defend them more or love them more or look out for them more than they themselves will do.
So final question for you, Cal, if I may. Yeah. Do you think that it's a prediction question, if you don't mind?
Well, I'm not a prophet, so...
Do you think we'll see an increase in tensions in the region with Bennett in place or a lessening? And is it possible that the recent skirmishes that you just mentioned, prior to Bennett assuming office, was that more about destabilizing Netanyahu's support in the parliament or the Knesset than it was about continuing hostilities?
Well, it's a cliche answer, Mark, but it all depends. I mean, all new leaders are tested. Biden is being tested by Putin at their meeting in Geneva. And so all new leaders are tested. So we'll see. I mean, if shelling starts again, if terrorist attacks start again within Israel, it depends on the government's response. I mean, a 60 to 59 majority in the Knesset is not exactly a mandate. And so we'll just have to see what happens. I suspect the attacks at some level will continue, especially after Hamas rebuilds in Gaza. And they're doing it with our help, with our tax dollars, which is ludicrous. Look, I've been in these. I've been to Gaza. I've been to Lebanon during Operation Peace for Galilee in the early 1980s. I've seen how they do this. They store their weapons in hospitals, in schools, in civilian areas, knowing that when Israel hits, they'll drag out, children and other people, innocent civilians, say, look what these horrible Jews have done. And of course, the Western media eat it up and portray Israel as a bandit and killers and murderers and the rest. So this is the way the game is played, and it'll depend. Netanyahu understood that better than anybody. It'll depend on what the government does in response to any new provocations.
Cal Thomas, thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Exhausted by all the fake news? On LibertyNation.com's YouTube channel, facts and fresh, bold analysis are what you get without the leftist spin. Subscribe today to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel and get our Ellen Radio, syndicated from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Listen to all the big names in politics with your host, Tim Donner. LNTV, the right analysis with our Liberty Nation authors from across the globe. The Uprising Podcast, fun and entertaining commentary on what's really going on in the swamp with Scott Cosenza and Tim Donner. All this and more when you subscribe to the LibertyNation.com YouTube channel today.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
There's an old saying, politics stops at the water's edge. It's first thought to have been said by GOP Senator Arthur Vandenberg in 1947. And this adage, it really came into its own during the Truman administration. And it's largely been followed by governments of all stripes ever since. Except, of course, for President Trump, who was raked over the Fourth Estate coals for breaking this unwritten rule in 2019 in his visit to Japan. Yet it seems that Joe Biden is keen to follow his predecessor in at least this one regard. After jetting off to Brussels on Air Force One to meet the great, not so great, and good, and not so good of Europe, the president took some time to criticize what he called President Trump's phony populism. And while this diplomatic faux pas was largely ignored by the domestic media, it may be useful to consider that all politics has now become global politics. Consider the agenda and areas of agreement that came about during the numerous meetings that took place in Joe Biden's week away. At the G7 summit, leaders agreed to a more westernized Belt and Road initiative to combat China. Now, for those of you with memories that stretch beyond that of the average goldfish, this appears to be TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, at least TTIP by any other name, should it smell as sweet. Now, that's certainly a win for the more globally minded. In the wake of recent cyber attacks in the US, Colonial Pipeline being one and America's largest beef processor being another, both the G7 and NATO agreed to a more globally comprehensive strategy for dealing with cybercrime. Quite what this means in reality is not known to the mere public, of course, but it seems difficult to imagine that it wouldn't come with the global regulation of the internet. There was, of course, talk of equity, equality, and justice, almost as if the world leaders had collectively decided that the new positioning of the Overton window was a done deal, and certainly not something on which the average voter should have a say. Remember, Joe Biden won his party's nomination for president because he was the least radical of the dozens of candidates on offer. To encapsulate this idea of equity and justice, perhaps Prime Minister Boris Johnson's words put it best. He said, and this is a direct quote, "The people of our countries now want us to be sure that we're beating the pandemic together and discussing how we'll never have a repeat of what we've seen, but also that we're building back better together, and building back greener, and building back fairer, and building back more equal, and, how shall I, in a more gender neutral and perhaps a more feminine way, how about that, apart from anything else?" End quote. Build back better, the mantra of the World Economic Forum and globalist leaders everywhere. What does that mean for the average Jack and Jill public? Clearly, this is rarely explained in detail, but if we consider the first 6 months of the Biden presidency as a hint, as a roadmap, if you will, it involves higher taxation, critical race theory in schools, businesses, and government bodies around the nation, and of course a focus on identity politics that would truly put affirmative action to shame. Now, this overseas adventure was indeed a test for Joe Biden. However, the examiners appear not to be the American people, as one would hope in a democracy of any description, but rather the cozy globalist union, who wanted to see if Joe Biden was still willing to back the international party line. At least in that respect, he appears to have passed with flying colors. And what of the media reception? Well, I think a few of us were surprised to see that those news outlets on the left considered the president's excursions a roaring success, and that those on the right were a lot more critical, accusing Joe Biden of coming back empty-handed. One aspect of note was that the Fourth Estate seemed particularly obsessed with the idea of how the European leaders treated the president, and of course how he treated them. Story after story came out about how now that President Trump is no longer in office, normal relationships can be resumed without someone there to try and push them all around. And while this may lead to a more relaxed atmosphere at these types of summit, it's worth considering that the root of the initial animosity between former President Trump and the NATO leaders was that he was belligerent in getting them to increase their funding contributions to the level that they had themselves already agreed to. Rather than treating him as someone who was trying to get them to keep their promises, they saw him as a heavy-handed debt collector or a repo man. There is something to be said for both approaches, of course. The strident attitude does get things done, but also the more relaxed, laissez-faire attitude does engender closer relationships. Now, how history will view this week-long excursion of President Joe Biden into the realms of the G7, NATO, and perhaps most significantly dealing with Russian President Vladimir Putin remains to be seen. No doubt our opinions will be sold to us in 30-second sound bites by the pundits in the media, whatever their political stripe. But perhaps the history books will be kinder than the pages of your local newspaper. I want to leave you with a few words from President Ronald Reagan when he spoke to the UN General Assembly in 1987. He said, quote, "We come from every continent, every race, and most religions to this great hall of hope, where in the name of peace we practice diplomacy. Now diplomacy, of course, is a subtle and nuanced craft, so much so that it's said that when one of the most wily diplomats of the 19th century passed away, other diplomats asked, on reports of his death, 'What do you suppose the old fox meant by that?' But true statesmanship requires not merely skill, but something greater, something we call vision, a grasp of the present and of the possibilities of the future." End quote. And regardless of the ills of the past, regardless of political bias, we cannot follow the truism of the old Soviet-era joke that goes, "The future is known, it's the past which is always changing." We must, as Reagan said, look to the future with a firm grasp of the present and encourage the possibilities of the future with great vision. And that's all we have time for on this week's Liberty Nation Radio. I want to thank our guests, Cal Thomas and Dave Patterson. And most importantly, I want to thank you, the listener, for being here. This show, The Uprising podcast, and the Rabbit Hole Politics and Prose podcast are all available on libertynation.com. Thank you again. We'll be back next week, same time, same place. And until then, I wish you well, and I wish you joy in your pursuit of ever more freedom.